welcome everybody again, and thank you for also for the 16 participant attendees that are online. Thank you for that. And what I would like to do now is introduce Dr. Donato Vozza. Dr. Donato Vozza will be with us and will moderate the second part of our panel. So Dr. Vozza is an expert in economic crime, corporate crime, and criminal law. He is a lecturer in law at Roundtable University and will be here. So Donato, will give you the floor, so you will moderate the second panel. There are some questions that will be from the previous panel, but you will moderate them at the end of the second panel. Thank you very much. Please, Donato.
Thank you, dear Costa. Good afternoon, everybody. So it's my pleasure and honor to chair this second session of our international roundtable discussion focused on corporations, governance, and crime. Let me thank Dr. Costantino Grasso, dear friend and colleague, for organizing with Stephen such a unique international event with speakers from different countries and backgrounds, in particular on the interconnections between corporate governance and crime. As already demonstrated in the previous session, and as will be demonstrated in this session, significant malpractices or collapses are generally the result of significant problems in companies' governance. Therefore, it is welcome that these issues are discussed with a multidisciplinary and practical focus on cases. I'm pleased to moderate an international panel composed of Dr. Dawn Carpenter from Georgetown University, Dr. Flavio Inocencio from Nova University Lisbon, Stephen Holden from Manchester Metropolitan University, and Giovanni Sodano from University Luigi Vanvitelli. Our speakers will cover 4 different cases. Each presentation will last around 10 minutes. If there are any questions from the audience, please raise your hands at the end of the presentation or write your questions in the chat of the Zoom session. So let's start with our first fantastic speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Dawn Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a leading authority for ethical finance. She's the director of the Solidarity Economy Workshop at Georgetown University and a veteran of Wall Street, where she is a recognized expert in the capitalization of social purpose corporations. Dr. Carpenter is also the host and executive producer of the What Does It Profit podcast. She's a senior advisor to the Vatican on economic justice issues and serves as a board advisor to several organizations. She holds graduate degrees in political science, public finance, Catholic theology, and earned an interdisciplinary doctorate in the field of liberal studies. Dr. Carpenter is joining us online from Washington, D.C. in the United States. The title of our presentation is Wirecard, Short Selling as a Tool for Ethical Markets. Dr. Carpenter, welcome to this session. Thanks for presenting such a critical case about Wirecard, and we look forward to listening to you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. Good. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be joining you here, and am grateful for all of the attorneys in the audience. I am not an attorney. You hear by my background, I am a finance professional, and I am hoping to tell you, well, I'm going to tell you a sad story, but hopefully with some hopeful aspirations for some solutions. And so let's get started. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Wirecard, so I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the company, and then I'm going to tell you about the scandal, and then I'm going to tell you about the part that I'm hopeful about. I've come to learn about this story because in the title of the presentation, I referenced the tool of short selling. In one of my previous podcast episodes on What Does It Profit, I had the pleasure of engaging with a woman named Kwame Fadir. The market calls her the assassin. She is a very famous short seller who had participated in uncovering a very significant fraud at a US pharmaceutical company. And so I had a discussion with her about that and followed me very closely. And she was very engaged with the Wirecard case. And so it's through my association with Fami Quadir that I'm telling you this story today. So Wirecard, what is Wirecard and what do they do? I reference here that Wirecard had been known as a beloved German fintech company. I don't know if there are any Germans in the audience, but the way the story goes is that the Germans were very keen on developing their fintech industry, and Wirecard came around to take a very significant leadership role. What they do, or what they did, was to process financial transactions between merchants and issuing card companies, between banks. And so they were the in-between information processor for that, and took a fee for doing so. And their mission, quite admirable or interesting, was to create a cashless society. And their name implies card. They were created in 1999 when the idea of these types of payments were with plastic. But Wirecard went on to develop its business to more mobile type technologies with smartphones and devices and so forth. So Wirecard has an interesting history. We won't go too much into it. They came out of a previous company that existed before 1999 that did some of this similar type work. So I say they were founded in 1999 as Wirecard, yes. Wirecard is a company that was based in Germany. They are have been identified as a fintech company, financial technology company, and not a bank. And that plays into part of their story later. But the company actually did own a Munich-based bank, but didn't operate as such. They also had operations in Dublin and Dubai. And I list here with this red arrow 3 other places to do the type of work that Wirecard was doing, which was this transfer of payments. It required licenses, and each location where they operated required a specific license, but it was somewhat cumbersome to acquire these licenses or acquire them in a time, in a quick manner. And so in Singapore, the Philippines, and Dubai, Wirecard entered into third-party processing agreements with other companies. And it was through this activity of engagement with these third parties that a good deal of the malfeasance was happening. So Wirecard grew very quickly. So it was not even 10 years into its creation that there were some suspicions being inquired about. And so their growth strategy only shown a much more, gave a broader light to what was going on as they continued to grow and grow very quickly. It began to be pointed out and noticed that they were working in very high risk or questionable areas. I have here such as, and there are others, illegal gambling and pornography, and areas of commerce that other processors shied away from for any number of reasons. But as I mentioned in the previous slide, in this high growth effort, there was this desire to process in other jurisdictions where they needed to develop these third-party partnership agreements. These agreements ostensibly were created and signed, and Wirecard was to earn a commission on the third-party transactions that went through these relationships. These commissions were said to fund escrow accounts. And those escrow accounts, in many ways that came to light, were never funded. And it began a decade-long inquiry into what was going on. So in 2008, we had the head of the German Shareholder Association filing a complaint with the regulator. The regulator in Germany is known as BaFin, which is akin to what we have here in the United States as the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so this shareholder association began to point out irregularities in the balance sheet. So when Charles was talking about knowing your accounting, yes, very important. And so Ernst & Young, which is a firm that has come up in a number of these cases, was hired to do a special audit at that time, and that was back in 2008. Believe it or not, that audit came back clean, and then Ernst & Young becomes the auditor of record for Wirecard. And so a couple of years pass, and in 2010, Wirecard made the decision in its high growth strategy to change its operating language to English. And so they went from German to English in an effort to promote this global activity. And then it wasn't 5 years later, as they were doing this this growth plan, that the Financial Times in the UK began to pick up on the continual scrutiny that had been happening during this time as the company was growing. And they wrote an article, interesting, called The House of Wirecard. And I guess you could point that to the metaphor of being a house of cards. But it was Dan McCrum, who was the journalist at the Financial Times, who had taken on this cause of determining what was really going on at Wirecard. And at that time, there was about a $250 million, 250 million euro hole in their balance sheet. And so this was in 2015. And the problem only got bigger. About a year later, there was a short selling group who came to focus pretty extensively on what seemed to be going on. And whenever there is a third party under the regulatory program at BaFin at the time, whenever there was a concern, there was a process, procedure that a party could go to bring the issue to the attention of the regulators. And in this case, it was a portal on the BaFin website. And so there were a number of hedge funds and short sellers who used this portal to raise their concerns. And then what had happened, interestingly, was that the response was to then inquire about the source of the accusations and make accusations against the short sellers and the whistleblowers in the case. And so there was a formal inquiry that happened in 2016. And so this continues to go on in the background, but Wirecard is continuing to grow. And by 2018, Wirecard actually is invited to join the DAX 30, which is a portion of the exchange that is a conglomeration of the top 30 performing companies in the German market. So they're on the Frankfurt Exchange, and the company is the darling of the tech world and the fintech world in Germany. And from the accounts of the journalists, was pretty well protected by the regulators. And it wasn't until, let's see, so in 2018, here we are with a market capitalization that had peaked at 24 billion. The research says dollars. I'm wondering if that may be euros. I'm not sure. But then a year later, the Financial Times continues to write about Wirecard because they're continuing to follow the accounting irregularities. And so kudos to the reporters who continue to go on this case. And so finally, the regulators have asked another accounting firm, KPMG, to do a report about a whistleblowing complaint for what was called, or what is called, round tripping. And if you're not familiar with this technique, it's essentially where you sell assets to a third party to repurchase in the following reporting period, so as to bolster or manipulate what is going on in earnings. And so that was the primary complaint that was being investigated. And then by 2019, the Financial Times continues to write about this and actually goes to investigate one of those third-party processors who was in the Philippines. And it turned out to be a fraudulent address and the home of I think it was a retired fisherman. So when the story is published, Wirecard sues the Financial Times. So that's in March of 2019. By October, there is this special audit by KPMG. And by the following April, the KPMG report comes out and raises even more questions, particularly around their inability to verify the cash balances in those escrow accounts. And so finally, by June of that year, Ernst & Young sees the KPMG report, and there's a notification to the Wirecard board that at this point, there's $2 billion missing. And so we started back at the beginning in 2008 with 250 million. Fast forward these 12 some years, we're now at 2 billion. And so BaFin files a criminal complaint against the CEO of Wirecard, and Wirecard files for insolvency. So what was going on with the short sellers? If you're not familiar, short selling is a tool that investors use to borrow a security whose price you think is going to fall. And why would an investor think a price would fall? Any number of reasons, but in most cases, it's significant mismanagement of the company. It could be fraud and the like. And so when these prices fall, you then can sell on the open market and buy back the stock later at a lower price, and you keep the difference. And so there's an economic incentive for these types of investors to really follow and dig in and uncover malfeasance. And so I mentioned just a moment ago that the German Shareholders Association filed this initial complaint in 2008, and then we have these stories in the Financial Times. And then by 2016, there is a 101-page report that was written by a short seller, basically outlining the significant concerns that this investor had with the operations of the company. And so the response to that report was that BaFin had inquired into the motivations of that short seller, suggesting that that short seller was providing this information and manufacturing this for the purposes of manipulating the market. And then, so by 3 years later, BaFin decides there's a lot of volatility in the price of the stock and decides to halt the sale of shorts in Wirecard. And that's when the short sellers protest. And so I mentioned in my introduction to how I became familiar with the story was what in my opinion is a brilliant, and I'll put it in the link in the chat if anyone is interested, a 15-page letter that Fahmy Quadir, the assassin short seller I mentioned, wrote in defense of the functions of short sellers to creating healthy markets. In my opinion, I think it was brilliant, and it actually turned the situation around. And in that letter that she wrote to BaFin protesting the halting of short selling, she made reference to a JP Morgan study that showed that 10% of trading volume globally is done by discretionary traders, which basically means everything else is change the adjective, is done by algorithms, whereas short sellers are really doing the hard independent analysis that results in trading activity of here only 10% of the market. And so these false claims that the short sellers were simply trying to manipulate markets, it's difficult to manipulate the market when you're only impacting 10% of it. And so that was her point. And the traders in her argument, she mentioned that the traders are really there to correct overvaluations. And so they go in and create transparency of information. She had a beautiful quote, which I think holds true in my opinion. There's no greater wealth destroyer than corporate deceit. And these investors try to uncover that. And we had talked earlier in the previous case studies about motivations. And she suggests in her argument that instead of having fraud being detected by insider corporate management, governance actors, she suggests that it's actually more efficient and effective when there's a monetary incentive to uncover and reveal fraud because you're motivated to do so. And clearly the argument is that greater transparency of information leads to healthier markets. And so I'm suggesting here that as we think about how to address these concerns, someone mentioned bad personal behavior. I happen to, you heard my academic background, I personally believe there's evil in the world, and it resides in all aspects of society. And so we can't really change that. But with greater transparency and more sunshine on the issue, we like to believe that with the right incentives, there can be ways to remedy these situations. And my argument here is that short selling can be a very effective tool to put the bad guys out of business, so to speak. And so in the Wirecard situation, I mentioned in the comments on one of the previous presentations, there's actually going to be a trial. Marcus Braun, who was the CEO, is set to go on trial, I believe, December 8th in Germany for embezzlement and market manipulation. Also on trial will be the accounting boss and the head of Wirecard Dubai. Interesting, the COO, Chief Operating Officer, is apparently hiding out in Moscow and hasn't been able to be extradited back to Germany just yet, but stay tuned. And as for staying tuned, if you are a consumer of entertainment on Netflix, there is actually a Netflix, hasten to call it documentary. It's more of a movie, if you will, called Scandal, but Scandal spelled Skandal, moderately interesting. But I would highly recommend Dan McCrum's book. He is the reporter from the Financial Times. So I leave you with that, and also likely the prospect of a class action lawsuit against Ernst & Young by shareholders. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dawn, for your fascinating and insightful presentation. We were already were here to discuss about your interesting point. Thank you very much for having focused your attention on this Germany's largest financial scandal, showing us how was created a cashless society and involvement in high-risk sectors. Thanks also for clarifying the role of the short selling and how is it connected with the mismanagement of a company, how it is a key indicator for fraud. So thanks a lot for looking at the ethical aspects and also the interconnection with the corporate governance issue. I have just a point, then we will discuss. Also, your analysis has shown the role of journalists as watchdog. And in particular, it's interesting how they are replacing the regulatory authorities, law enforcement agencies in their activities. Sometimes we are more journalists than lawyers, because the law is not enough for us to understand what is going on. And so thanks for this, because this is another important element, no, of our reflection.